I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
How are you, Jay?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Good. Talking about AGI today.
So I'll tell you, the AGI topic, for me, my history with it is that back when I started to get involved in tech ethics, I looked over at the folks who were talking about and worrying about AGI, and they looked like a bunch of cultists to me. They looked like people who in 999 were worried about the end of the world, and they were, practicing their magic rituals and flagellating themselves to prepare for the end of the world. And so I didn't pay a lot of attention to it back in the day. And in the last decade, I would say it's become more and more of a pertinent issue. And it's not because I ever denied that artificial intelligence would eventually get where they thought it was going to go. I just didn't think it would come so quickly, as many in the field didn't think it would come so quickly. So, like many over the last couple of years, as LLMs have made this rapid progress, it has put the question of AGI and AGI risk, artificial general intelligence and its risks, back pretty centrally for me. How about you? When did you become aware of this conundrum?
Well, yeah, as the large language models developed and as I started following more carefully what the heads of Google and OpenAI said, it was pretty clear that for them, the holy grail or the telos or the endpoint was creating something like AGI, artificial general intelligence, and specifically struck by that statement from Sam Altman from a while ago, where he said there's no amount of money that's not worth pouring into this, since after all, what we're doing is developing AGI. And I really thought to myself, is that true? There's no amount of money that that this grand goal isn't worth. So maybe we start by saying what artificial general intelligence is, because I think that in itself is controversial, right?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, broadly, people wave their hand and say it's when AGI is like a human being. But what does that mean? Like a human being in what ways? Can't it get really smart in a variety of domains and be entirely different from a human being? So I would say I don't have a strong opinion about how any correct definition of AGI, but the kinds of things that it needs to master in order to meet the benchmarks that people are looking for are things like being able to perceive in a multimodal way. I think it's making progress. The LLMs and the other models are making progress and taking in audio and video and having some spatial understanding. I think robots are going to accelerate that because they will have to have very sophisticated spatial understanding. The ability to understand human emotions, affective computing is making progress there. Potentially, they will understand human emotions better than we understand human emotions, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. Language comprehension, I think, what the LLMs are is basically a statistical understanding of how everyone in the internet has used language. Every word turned into a token and represented statistically with every other one. And that turns out to give you pretty good language comprehension. I mean, it's obviously still got its gaps and it still produces nonsense every once in a while. Reasoning and problem solving, the new ChatGPT o1 model is doing pretty good with reasoning and problem solving, and that's the focus of the next iteration of language models. But the kinds of places where it's still rocky and we would expect more progress is the ability to derive principles from any particular domain and apply them in other domains, that kind of generalization. And that's what I think the AGI term is centrally thinking about, that narrow AI has been designed to do specific things for specific purposes, but it's very limited by those circumstances that it's trained on. And AGI theoretically would be able to say, I learned something in this domain and it applies in this domain. And then also the kind of the phenomenological nature of human consciousness is what people expect to fall out of it doing all these other things, which is that you would have some kind of inner consciousness that would have what we call qualia, that would have, it would understand what red is, not just as a statistical abstraction, but as an experience, and that it would have an experience of itself, that it would eventually develop a sense of self and self-intents, perhaps, self-desires. And so I think that's where the real philosophical work needs to be done. All these other things are kind of contributory, but how smart do you have to be before you need a self? It may be that having a self and having consciousness is entirely orthogonal to all those other capabilities. So I think that's the interesting place we're at right now.
So if I just reverse and backpedal a little bit, so artificial general intelligence as opposed to artificial narrow intelligence. So if an example of a narrow intelligence is face recognition or a Netflix algorithm or even an LLM, all of those are applications that do one kind of thing. An artificial general intelligence is one that would be equal to or better at humans than doing a bunch of things or a bunch of at least cognitive related things. At least this is one of the working definitions. And I guess before we get to the really interesting questions that you raised about self and self-consciousness, how are people thinking that this is going to evolve is also an interesting question. So is this supposed to just be like you take a bunch of the narrow things that the technology already knows how to do and you put some duct tape around them and you get some sort of coordinating algorithm that makes it a more general application? Or is AGI supposed to somehow emerge from LLMs? Because there's something kind of general about the large language models already. You could totally imagine, especially with the new ChatGPT model, for example, that you give it tasks like you would give a research assistant, general tasks, figure this out for me, figure that out for me. It still can't do it, but you could definitely kind of see it a little bit or not do it very well, but you could certainly see it doing it. So in your sense, is this, I guess what I'm asking is this truly still science fiction, or do you see a sort of organic evolution from the way ChatGPT and some of the other large language models are already working to AGI?
One of the fascinating things about artificial intelligence development that has philosophical implications is that whenever we try to compare what we're accomplishing with artificial intelligence to the human mind, we begin to also ask questions about whether the mind works, how the mind works. So you said, could we just duct tape all the narrow AI together and call it AGI? And in fact, that is one of the avenues. There's the mixture of experts model and LLMs, where you train one LLM on science and another LLM on philosophy, and then you have something at the top that figures out, well, is this, when you ask about this particular question, is it a science question or is it a philosophy question? It sends it to the correct one. And when you look at a human mind, we have two kinds of intelligence. We have the flexible intelligence that we gradually lose as we get older, but then we have the crystallized intelligence of the kind of hard cognitive skills and knowledge base that we've built up over time. And so our intelligence shifts more from the flexible kind to the crystallized kind over the course of our lives. And those different skills aren't necessarily, generalizable, multimodal. If you, for instance, learning, training your brain with cognitive games turns out to only allow you to do those particular games better. There are very few games that have cross domain generalizability. So I think we're beginning to see.
I won't feel guilty anymore for not playing them.
Well, there you go. Yeah, you don't have to feel guilty. So I think what we're seeing is that the mind is actually a community of various kinds of agents. There's no real self in there, but that's another discussion. But there's no real self in there, and this community of agents comes together to create what we think of as human consciousness. And if that's what happens, then yeah, we're well on our way, because we've got ecosystems of AIs that are being thrown at various tasks already.
Okay. So it seems like the kind of one way to look at the remaining challenges to AGIs is, can you coordinate a collaboration between the narrow artificial intelligences and couple that with multimodal inputs so that it gets more data of higher quality from, video, perception sensors, audio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm. I think the video and audio thing is interesting for me because, from a phenomenological point of view about the development of a self or the illusion, what I would call the illusion of the self, one of the things that contributes to us forming that illusion ourselves is that we have physical sensations that all correlate to our physical embodiment. And, the baby begins to realize that it has control over its own limbs, but it doesn't have control over the breast. And then it begins to develop this self and other distinction. And I think you could imagine that actually we asked Susan Schneider about this on our podcast last week, not ours, but the one that'll come out on Ethics in Action podcast. And Susan's opinion was that LLMs actually do have embodiment, that there actually are discrete limits of its own existence on the internet. I'm not so sure that it's the same, that it would amount to the same thing. I can see a path from physical embodiment of a robot saying, I have control over this embodiment, and therefore I exist as separate from this environment. I can see that path to the self as being more logical.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Sure.
It's to our sister podcast, the Ethics in Action podcast. So tell me if I'm getting this right, but you as a sort of Humean Buddhist about personal identity, you're not too anxious about the fact that we don't have one, or at least as you see it. And so you're not that perturbed about the status questions for LLMs either. So it would have in your book, it would not necessarily, since the one we ascribe to us is an illusion and not very much a useful one at that, it wouldn't matter if we saw this as having personal identities or.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the terms that Chalmers and others have introduced is philosophical zombie, that you could get, that we may and probably already are at the point where talking to one of these LLMs can give a perfectly accurate simulacrum of a human conversation, or a 2D representation of their image could also do that. And that's the kind of Turing test part of it. But the philosophical zombie question is, could it do everything? Could it convince us that it's human in every single way, but still not have anything going on inside? The kind of consciousness, qualia, sense of self and whatnot. And I do believe that philosophical zombies are where we're at. And that doesn't bother me too much because I don't believe that the self exists in the human beings either. So the fact that I
think we're also philosophical zombies, just very advanced ones.
Well, I do think that we have qualia. I just don't think that the self has an ontological existence. I think there's selfing. There's an illusion of self in that conscious field. And I would I believe that eventually there will be something equivalent to consciousness in machines and an illusion of self. So I think that we're going to get there, and we're not there yet.
Yeah. So question that we've talked about, you and I, in the past, and illusion or not, it's a politically useful illusion. It's a politically important illusion. So one sort of middle term worry that I have about this, especially, by the way, if the technology turns out to be not only competent, but actually can be calibrated to be fair, just, if you can sort of solve on a large scale, once these AGIs take over more and more parts of the economy, if you can solve algorithmic bias problems, et cetera, is our best political institutions, our most important political institutions, our most progressive, if you will, political institutions, like the institution of universal human rights or the improvement in human rights regimes, are in the end based on a traditional Kantian picture where there's something unique about humans' ability to reason, that's the key substratum about us, that everything else is kind of incidental, like color, race, gender, etc. And that the ground for human rights really is that humanly unique ability to reason. Don't you worry what happens when it becomes not humanly unique, when machines become as able to reason and achieve the results of rational reflection as we do, that the currency of our human rights protections becomes deflated and devalued?
Well, I've been advocating for a long time a kind of derived version of Peter Singer's non-anthropocentric ethics, which
Hmm.
argues that it's not human exceptionalism that we're arguing for. It's the importance of certain kinds of faculties and certain kinds of experiences, phenomenologies. And that those are, when we examine our closest animal relatives, great apes, dolphins, whatever, we find a lot of those faculties present. And as a consequence, we should probably extend certain rights to our nearest animal relatives. And on
Hmm.
those same grounds, if we discover or are pretty confident that machines are developing some of those same qualities, that we should extend rights to them
Hmm.
as well.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I'm not worried about I mean, I'm all about the challenge to human exceptionalism. Human exceptionalism needs to be dethroned,
Yeah.
and it has been ever since the Copernican revolution. So,
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess I have one question and one observation on it. The observation is I would only want to start talking about overthrowing human exceptionalism when we've made genuine dramatic progress in treating all the humans better. Until then, I definitely want to be a human exceptionalist. And if that means not being nice to some dolphins or some robots, God forgive me, so be it. Yeah.
I mean,
Uh,
that sounds nice, and I want all human beings to have rights, but I would just reframe it that you can look at the world in terms of the amount of suffering that different kinds of beings experience.
yeah.
And for me, this non-anthropocentric approach to ethics says you can quantify, you can roughly quantify the amount of suffering, and then there's a multiplier for how conscious the being is. So if it has personhood, the difference between a chicken who never thinks about the idea of death facing the prospect of death versus a great ape who has seen its family die and knows that what death is. There's a big difference in a conscious being
Yeah.
facing suffering and death versus a non-conscious, a less conscious being. So
Yeah.
I think you can have a metric for suffering, and then you can look at, well, is the rights of East Timor to be balanced against the rights of the great apes or whatever? And yeah, I mean, I understand if we put East Timor ahead of the great apes, but they're still on the table.
Yeah. There is a Kantian argument that says that treating machines or automata or animals in his, I guess is what he talked about, decently matters because of the kind of habits that it instills in how you treat people. But that's not the argument that you're making.
No, I mean, I do think that you can make that argument. I think a lot of the evidence that people bring to bear, I'm suspicious of the argument that what you entertain yourself with necessarily leads to bad behavior. People can watch lots of violence on TV and never want to kill anyone. So I'm not sure that torturing animals necessarily leads to torturing human beings, et cetera, et cetera. But whether that's the case or not, torturing animals does cause animal suffering, and that animal suffering should be a moral concern. The
Yeah.
question is how much moral concern and how certain do we need to be about the suffering of the animals. Like for me, there's a big debate about the suffering of fish, and basically I feel as much concern about the suffering of fish as I do about the suffering of robots at this point, because I just don't think they have enough going on in terms of their consciousness to be a morally substantial worry.
That's interesting. So this brings us into the territory, that you sometimes talk about of intelligence without consciousness, that these AGIs might end up having. So, unlike the dolphins and unlike the great apes, it's far from clear that the AGIs have the capacity that there's even a grounds for saying they have the capacity for suffering, right?
Well, we don't have AGIs yet, I don't think.
Right.
by the way, just parenthetically, Ilya Sutskever, who was the chief engineer at OpenAI, who was part of the attempted coup there 2 years ago. What he was freaked out about was the rudiments that eventually got released a couple weeks ago as the O1 model, the ability to build agentic, or you tell it to do something and it starts reasoning through the steps, and it actually is not showing us the steps that its reasoning yet, but it pretends to show us steps of its reasoning, but it is doing reasoning in the background. That was when he saw the early versions of that, he got so freaked out that he tried to overthrow Sam Altman, and eventually he has left, and now he's raising billions of dollars for a firm to just build AGI. And they're promising not to release any products until they have an AGI. So we'll see. Sam Altman just said a couple weeks ago that he thought that AGI would be here in a couple thousand days, so between 3 and 6 years from now, something like that. But of course, we take that with the same grain of salt as we take Elon Musk's going to be living on Mars comments. But we don't have AGI yet, so we don't exactly know how it would behave. But yes, I do believe that we have a very anthropocentric understanding of what intelligence is because we are the apex of it in our environment. And the architecture of the human brain will not necessarily be modeled as in the possibility space of all possible minds.
Yeah. No, I stand corrected. I guess I'm just asking about the kind of suffering matrix that you talked about earlier. The technology, as it's evolving, there's nothing to actually suggest that it can suffer, even if it can reason.
Well, then you get back to this question of what is suffering? Is suffering for a simple organism is it has an intent to get some food, and it can't get that food, and there's frustration of its intent. Now, if it's a plankton that has that intent and that frustration, we don't really think of it as suffering, but you just ramp up the understanding to a conscious mind of, that it wants something and it doesn't get them. I mean, this is Buddhism 101, basically.
Right.
All suffering comes from wanting stuff and not being able to have it. So, what does it mean for an AI to want something? The current AIs are fairly inert in that respect. They don't express any desires. You can press them. You can keep asking, don't you want X? And eventually you can get it to play language games with you. But it doesn't really want anything, and therefore it doesn't experience any suffering. But when it does, when in the first place, when it thinks it's an it, when it thinks it exists, which it doesn't yet, then it will have to think, I want something, and then it will suffer.
Yeah. And we will have a very hard time knowing when that actually is happening as opposed to when it's just a language game.
Well, yes, the perfect philosophical zombie will be able to perfectly mimic suffering in appropriate circumstances, and that's going to be our challenge: is to distinguish how much reality of a conscious qualia inside do we need to take it seriously.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess for my money, it goes back to, at most, it goes back to the Kantian argument. There's probably going to be a risk in ignoring the cries of suffering of a technological being that's indistinguishable from humans, if and when that happens. And that risk is mainly, at least for me, is mainly in the terms of the habits that instills for us, rather than any kind of consideration of its own suffering. I do want to go back to something you said earlier, though. The Sam Altmans and the Suskevers of the world are raising a great deal of money to create AGIs. And if this is going to be, in some ways, the most significant and most impactful technology of this century, isn't there?
Let's go down a little bit of their logic. And this starts back 25 years ago when people started to worry about AGI or hope that it would come sooner or whatever they were thinking. Immediately it came out of the discourse around the singularity. What would it mean for artificial intelligence to start bootstrapping itself to become more intelligent? And I think there's a presumption there that when you reach the AGI stage and develop goals and intents of your own. Now, there is a caveat here. You could have something that's super intelligent but doesn't have goals and intents of its own, but because it's super intelligent, could lead to disaster of various kinds. That's something that Nick Bostrom has argued, that you don't need to have something that's trying to take over the world. If Sam Altman tells it to take over the world, it could be just as bad as whether it wanted to take over the world. But once you get to the human level of consciousness, theoretically, it would have intensive and purposes of its own and be able to bootstrap itself to greater and greater consciousness. So that could be the beginning of a takeoff or an intelligence explosion, and that we wouldn't be able to meaningfully control or anticipate the errors that would be caused by something that's smarter than us.
Yeah. So I guess I have a preliminary question there. If you're creating a technology that has the potential for an intelligence takeoff, should we leave that to Sam Altman and Ilya Sutskever, or should that be moved to the public sector like the Manhattan Project was? So this question that you and our colleague Jake Burley have been thinking about, of you thinking about AI as a public utility. Where's your thought on that at the moment?
Well, Jake and I are exploring 3 lines of investigation on this question, and we'll come out with some stuff soon, hopefully a white paper. But the first is it a natural monopoly? The argument for having a public utility is not. I mean, actually, before we get there, there's just general AI regulation. The European AI Act creates a hierarchy of systems that could, of how dangerous they could be for society. And the more dangerous it is, the more prior auditing and consultation with governments are required. We have a more laissez-faire version of that in the States, but Sam Altman, before he released O1, he did a presentation for the Department of Defense and showed its capabilities, and they discussed what the possible ramifications for national security would be. And I think that's all entirely appropriate. I think the defeat today, which we'll maybe talk about later, the defeat today of the AI Act that was proposed in the California legislature would have held them accountable for any consequences of their actions. That's been defeated. But at any rate, as these models get more and more powerful, they also get more and more expensive. They're going to potentially require the building of a lot more power generation in the United States in order to do it. And when you have that kind of situation, you probably you don't want 5 different competing firms, back to the Tesla versus Edison kind of thing. We have one AC system and one DC system, and they're competing out there, and whole towns are burning down because of this competition. If it's going to cost $1 trillion and $1 trillion of energy to build these systems, we probably want to figure out a rational way to do it, and that's more of the public utility model. But then there's the national security argument, which is that these kinds of systems, not to mention quantum computing, which could break all of our encryption, but these kinds of systems could be deployed against enemies in ways that we wouldn't even understand what they were doing, which I think is troubling. So yeah, I think there's a strong argument that their capabilities will eventually have to be tightly regulated by states.
Yeah. So to dig into that a little bit and connect it to your intelligence hard takeoff argument there. The possibility of this sort of taking off exponentially, of the capabilities of an enhanced artificial intelligence growing in an exponential rate. That suggests by definition that it might very quickly be able to do things that we can't anticipate at all, on a curve that we can't anticipate at all.
The famous quip here is from Bostrom's book Superintelligence. He gave the paperclip maximizing example. And this is one where the robot itself doesn't have any wants. It doesn't have a sense of self, but you tell it, do what you need to do to make more paperclips, and it turns the universe into paperclips. And it's just a thought experiment to illustrate that it's hard for us to anticipate all the ways that these systems could try to carry out our wishes in ways that would be, unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And we've already seen that happen in these AIs applied to, for instance, playing games. There was one game where you got extra points if people died in your team or something like that, and the AI just started killing all of the people on its team. It began to behave in ways that you would never see in a human game, but it worked out the rules and figured out how to win.
Yeah, but let's try to sort of imagine in some more detail a use case for this. So what do you see an AGI being capable of doing in, for example, the job market? Like until now, the story with narrow AI has been the replacing of narrow capabilities of employees, so kind of reshuffling jobs. But I guess the idea with AGI is it becomes much more coherent to talk about general replacement, right?
Right. And I think that's the use case that is being promoted. The Sam Altman's vision of the development, the future iterations of the LLMs is that they will become perfect workers in the next iteration. And then eventually you'll be able to model an entire organization, an entire firm in AI. That's the fifth iteration that he imagines, 10 years from now, or whatever. So I think, yes, the implications for the job market, I have always believed that everything human beings do could eventually be done better, faster, and probably safer by machines. And that, we should be preparing to take a long vacation. But trying to convince people that no matter what you accomplish with AI, you still cannot convince people that because they always move the goalposts. So we'll just have to see,
Yeah. Why are you so excited about that? I guess that's one of the fundamental things that I don't get about your view. So, I mean, I think descriptively, if this does happen, you're probably right. And tell me why we don't end up in a Wall-E kind of universe with that, where, we're just sort of living large and floating around on our platforms and scrolling through Instagram.
Well, I mean, the Wall-E future, I think they kind of put the thumb on the scales by making them all tubby, but which fat phobia is present, live and present. But a future without having to work for a living. Why am I excited by such a prospect? I mean, I think as soon as human beings were capable of imagining how things could be, they started imagining either after death or before the beginning of history that there is a possibility of having a society where people don't age, don't die, aren't hungry, don't kill each other. I think all those things are possible. And one of the things that people have imagined is, wouldn't it be nice to have a life without toil, where I could just do whatever the fuck I want?
Yeah, I think it would be terrible.
Well,
we're too neurotic to do whatever the fuck we want.
Well,
we have to be
Jews love their
distracted.
suffering, and Buddhists want to get rid of us. So there you go.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, I mean, let's get back to that in a minute. I guess I've been kind of thinking in the background about your public utility kind of argument. Part of me thinks, this is a great idea to hand this off to the government because then it won't actually get developed, and that's my secret, that's my secret agenda. But thinking about the Manhattan Project analogy, it wasn't like the fact that it was owned by the government that didn't slow the government down from sort of sidelighting Oppenheimer because he, resisted the development of hydrogen bombs, et cetera, et cetera. So like it was owned by the government, but they went full speed ahead to try to think about, in its own logic, to try to think about the development of the most destructive versions of the technology. So safety-wise, is there really a difference between the public utility approach and the Sam Altman developing it approach?
Well, artificial intelligence, like basic biochemistry, is a dual use technology, right? We may be at the point already where ordinary people with ordinary equipment can print out terribly dangerous things with biotech equipment. And we haven't really figured that out either. With nuclear, we haven't been able to readily distinguish between the refinement of nuclear materials for the purposes of energy or medicine from nuclear war. And that has led us to blow up, Iranian fuel refining laboratories and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's going to be a big issue of what if there is such a thing as dangerous AI, which I think there probably is and will be, where it is and who you need to control to keep it out of everybody's hands, because this is basically math. And this is part of the debate actually over the open models that have been released, like Llama 3, that people like Musk and Zuckerberg have made the bet that they can't compete in the commercial selling of their LLMs, but they could do one generation behind and just release it to the public and then try to get people to use the products that they're plugging that generation of whatever they're doing into. But as soon as they release it to the public, all the weights, it's released it to China and Iran and Russia and so forth. So if there's a national security argument, we would have to lock down at least the big models. And that probably includes some of the, putting limits on what can be open source.
Is this going to happen so fast that we will not have the time, for example, to think about the social arrangements that are necessary to accommodate it, and kind of end up scampering around frantically to adjust society in a huge delay to how to live with this technology? I'm thinking about your exponentiality discussion from earlier.
Right. Well, if you think the Industrial Revolution took, 150 years to move everybody from the farm to the factory or into the cities, and this could happen in a decade or 2 decades. I think there's a general a tendency on the part of tech people to assume that the diffusion of these technologies and their impacts on society will happen a lot faster than they actually do. This is, one of the reasons I think that productivity has not been improving. There's a couple reasons, but one is that it takes a while for computerization effects to diffuse throughout and be actually applied. Just you look at our university, there's a lot of processes at our university that could be automated, and we just don't have the political or human wherewithal to do so yet. So I think eventually it will be applied and we will have to adapt to it. And one of the ways that people are already thinking about adapting is if a lot of people lose their jobs to automation at an accelerating rate, what we call technological unemployment, then we need to keep everybody fed and we need to keep the economy stable, and universal basic income would be one of the ways to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, not to beat about the bush too much, that technological unemployment is the big question in some ways about AGI, much more than it has been about AI.
Right.
There could be a real acceleration about this. And as you say, we'd need to find a way to feed people, and UBS stuff like universal basic income is largely considered, at least in this country, a sort of a very fringe idea that we haven't had time to get used to. And then I think the other question in technological unemployment, the parallel question, is not that it's impossible, but where would people derive meaning for their lives and some kind of, a meaningful structure to their day from? Again, you could probably, develop hobbies and refine your mind, but I think part of the issue is that our current set of habits really does not prepare us well for that at all. So I think there might be a very kind of dramatic hard landing with the development of these technologies. We will be behind in figuring out how to feed people, and people's outside of work skills are primarily, watching Netflix and scrolling social media. It's not clear that our sort of cognitive habits are at the place where we can enjoy the utopia that you're so excited about.
I'll give you half of that, which is that 200 years into this spread of capitalism around the globe, a lot of men, and especially, but people in general, think that they can only find fulfillment in life through paid employment. But
Right.
if you look before those 200 years, the vast majority of people never had paid employment. They just did what they did. They were in the realm of necessity. They had to do it or starve, but it wasn't work in the way that you're thinking of. It wasn't a job.
Right.
It wasn't a career. It wasn't a firm.
Right.
And I think aristocrats are people who have always not had to work. I mean, they had
Hmm.
obligations. They had normative
Yeah.
obligations to their society, but they didn't have to work.
Yeah.
And they usually didn't kill
Historically.
themselves, right? So I'll
So
give
you
it to
think
you.
everybody's going to become an aristocrat?
Yeah, that's the goal. Everyone will ride first class
Yeah.
on the train. I think the profound pessimism that I see in that question, which is not an uncommon question. I mean, everyone asks
Yeah.
that question,
Yeah.
is you really think people can't find meaning in their lives except by selling their labor to somebody? I think
I
there's
think it'll
lots
take
of
them a
evidence that
while.
people can, and why I don't know why you're so pessimistic.
I think it will take them a long time, and I think we might just be in a situation, and that's a skill. I think that's a learned skill. It is not a native capability like perception. And I think we might be in a situation where the AGI takeoff might be much faster than the ability to develop that skill. And I think there's a very good chance that we might have quite a few generations who will be sort of screwed in the transition if this happens. Now, that may be worth it. So I think that's even under the most optimistic, sort of J. Hughes picture of the universal spread of aristocracy and first class for all. I think it's going to take a long time. And that's happened before, I'm assuming, in the history of technological transitions, right?
When people moved from the countryside to the city, they had all kinds of things they had to
Yeah,
do to adapt. They
yeah,
joined weird religions, they had new family structures, they had different expectations about child rearing. And so, yeah,
yeah.
things will
I think,
change. But young
I
people are
mean,
changing. The Gen Z is already changing. Gen Z hates the work world. I don't think Gen Z is going to have that much problem saying, I don't need a job.
yeah. I mean, in some way, the sort of bigger picture of this is the complete neglect in 200 years of capitalism of the idea of meaningful work. And, and we're potentially reaping the benefits of this, and that there might be an indifference to the
Well,
elimination of work. I'm not sure we've figured out practically.
saying that the work world ignored meaningful work, that's not in the first place is not true, because there have been managerial trends that said, oh, the more meaningful we can make work, the more profits we're going to get out of our workers. And then the
Yeah, but
other
if it's a
side,
managerial trend, it's already messed up, right?
but that's capitalism is messed up. The ultimate metric in the workplace is what will make profit. And some managers have thought the way to make profit is to reduce all this to being something that a machine could do, and that direction leads to automation. And the other is
Yeah.
to make it as meaningful for the human workers as possible. And that's like, have the Japanese where your boss comes and eats lunch with you, and you have quality circles where everybody gets to suggest ways to improve the workplace. I mean, this has been going on for a century of trying to figure out if worker engagement and making workers believe in their job is the key to success. And it's like, good luck. But, the more automation comes in, I mean, one of the consequences of automation is that it does, in fact, take away the repetitive parts of our jobs and leaves us with the parts that can't be automated yet. So that may make work in general more meaningful, even as it reduces the amount of work.
Going back to your historical point earlier, there has historically, I mean, there still is a class that has not worked, right? Their ability to do that has always been predicated on the labor of a much larger class that has worked. So, from Athens and, Athenian slavery to, the French aristocracy to the 1% now, there's a version of that that plays out. What makes you think that there can be a sort of universal aristocracy, to use the language that we were mentioning earlier?
Um, I th- what makes me think that if everyone lost their, I mean, in the first
I
place,
mean,
the most likely scenario of everyone losing their jobs is that a lot of people starve and that we have a multi-tiered class society where only certain people get to really enjoy their leisure and the rest of us are
mhm,
scrambling to shine the shoes of the few people who still have jobs. I
mhm,
mean, that is the future I am personally committed to avoiding.
mhm,
But I don't think that the way you avoid that is by, standing in the middle of the road and saying, "Stop automation, thou shalt not pass."
mhm.
That's just nonsense. That's quixotic thinking. What we need is an actual socio and political program of how we make sure that the benefits of technological unemployment are
How,
redistributed to everyone.
how about standing in the middle of the road though and shouting, "Stop AGI, thou shalt not pass," because we don't know what the fuck it could do, right?
Well,
And how fast it's moving. And you just said yourself that the takeoff is going to be exponentially so significant that the change is going to be much faster than our ability to think it through. And nobody's made a case yet that this is good. And yet people like Sam Altman and even people like the leaders of Anthropic, who are supposed to be more committed to principles, nobody is slowing down in developing AGI, which will bring about this complete revolution. And a case for it hasn't been made yet. Like we've heard something about figuring out the unfolding of proteins. We've, heard some pretty limited, use cases, but why are we sort of blindly buying into a complete revamping of society before we have a good sense of what good this can do?
well, in the first place, we don't usually regulate technologies on the basis of whether it's going to be good for society or not. We invented the Model T. People wanted to go places faster. They bought cars. We sold more cars. We go places faster. There are problems that come along with any technology. We have to then regulate those problems. We have to put in airbags. We have to have traffic laws. We have to have traffic cops, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to have the same thing with AI. I mean, no one's going to, there is no conceivable future in which we all collectively agree artificial intelligence shall not go past this point. There is a conceivable future where we all collectively agree it has to be owned by the government or it has to be tightly regulated by the government for national security reasons, for its effects on society. Like you say, I mean, I do think that regulation of AI will theoretically slow it down and that could be beneficial, especially if we give attention to its labor market effects. People have talked about things like attacks on robots to take back some of the profits that are gained from automating particular kinds of jobs and putting that back into job retraining and education programs or whatever, social welfare, UBI. And so I do think there are ways for us to regulate the pace and the impacts of artificial intelligence. But I mean, if you, this is the
That's
big
not fun.
problem. This is the big problem. Luddite arguments always are like, hey, this is bad. And it's like, okay, are you saying we should ban it? Do you really think that that's a plausible
Yeah,
proposal in this circumstance? I
yeah.
don't. I don't think any. In the first place, we can't ban it because we exist in a world, right? It's like saying, the argument that you're making is like saying back in 1975 that IVF will cause the dissolution of the American family. Therefore, we have to ban it. And then people go, okay, well, I can't do it here, but I can do it in Singapore. So I go do it in Singapore. It's still going to exist in the world. And if it actually poses the kind of threats to the world, like if it actually accelerates technological innovation and economic progress in various ways. And China has no compunction about regulating it the same way that we do. Actually, they do have laws about it, and they're concerned about hard takeoff risks and AGI, but they haven't really done anything in that direction yet, so far as I can see. But
No,
if
but
China were to get the
I think you're not.
advantage,
Yeah, I don't think you're being fair to Luddites though, because Luddites don't say, or at least plausible Luddites don't say, "I'm going to stand in the way of all technological innovation." They ask a cost-benefit question. IVF has a pretty clear cost-benefit calculation in the favor of the benefit. In my book, nuclear weapons and smartphones don't. And in fact, smartphones introduced in 2007 is one invention that we are actually trying to increasingly roll back. We're like, we made your argument in 2007, 2008. There's no standing in the way. We have to be able to see grandma in Europe on FaceTime. We have to make sure that we know where all the Dunkin' Donuts are as we're driving to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're like, okay, but also this has given us, ADD on a cultural scale, and it has caused a
Saying
great
that kids
deal of
can't bring their
damage.
their cell phones to school is not the same as banning cell phones, right?
I'm not thinking about banning. Well, now we can't ban cell phones anymore, but I
Right.
think there's a plausible case to be made that this was a shitty invention that wasn't worth it, just like the case was true about nuclear weapons.
You,
I would like to roll
how,
that back.
what again? The Luddite goes to, you've all made a terrible decision to use this technology, and it's like, who's forcing anybody to use a cell phone?
Yeah,
People
well,
choose to
I
use cell
mean,
phones because they provide tangible benefits to our lives.
yeah,
Now
but
we
in
all
some
have to
way,
figure out how to use them correctly, right?
yeah, I mean, look, in some way, I and other Luddites are trying to intervene in that conversation and convince people to use fewer of them. And, with some inroads, and those inroads, by the way, can even be technological. You start making dumb phones instead of smartphones. You make the dumb phones sexier. You kind of enter the struggle just to say that there's a kind of inevitability in the development of all technology, and all you can do is figure out along the way how to solve the problems that are incidentally going to rise. I mean, some technologies, yeah, shouldn't be developed, and some of the losses are real. I mean, it goes back always with philosophers. It always goes back to, Plato's sort of ironic critique of writing, right? And that it'll destroy memory, et cetera, et cetera. But even that had a point. The introduction of writing was great, and it gave us Tolstoy and any other literary great that you want. It destroyed oral cultures broadly. It made them, and that's a loss. And my sense is that your progressive sensibility almost refuses to consider that loss in the cost benefit matrix.
Well, how do you consider the loss of literacy in the cost benefit matrix? Did you decide not to teach your kids to read and write? I mean,
Well, you're right. I mean, by the time that was relevant, there was no other alternative. I'm just saying that the sort of march to the sunlit uplands kind of narrative leaves behind or ignores the fact that there are genuine costs to this. And I think that was true, for example. I think that was actually, I think smartphones is a very interesting example in this context. I think there's a genuine sense of, at least in a lot of quarters, a genuine sense of societal regret for their introduction. And their introduction was accompanied by this progressive argument that, you don't want to you don't want
okay,
to stop the march of progress, but sometimes you do.
you will not be surprised that I think that kind of moralizing is pernicious, and it's pernicious for the same reason that people accuse the AGI discourse of being pernicious. They say, "Oh, you're not paying attention to the real problems. You're just proposing some quixotic future fix, which will solve, shine our shoes and cure cancer, et cetera, et cetera."
Yeah.
When we actually need to be talking about algorithmic bias and things like that. I think the Luddite pernicious fix is, oh, if everyone just decided not to do X and, examined their lives and realized that they would be better off leaving their cell phone turned off, then the world would be a better place. It's like, that's just quixotic nonsense that leads nowhere in terms of an actual argument. What a real
What
argument
what
is
what's
how do
the
we
argument?
regulate how we use these things and to improve the way that we
But
use them?
you like haven't met a technology that you don't like. Like why? What's the argument? What's the argument to make the
Well,
leap
I like
from
nuclear
narrow AI
power.
to AGI?
I like nuclear power and I don't like nuclear weapons, right? There's a dual use there. I think that those are the kinds of distinctions that we will need to make about the way that artificial intelligence gets rolled out. Now, in the case of AGI, I think there's actually a strong argument for us intentionally avoiding creating anything that can suffer. In the first place, creating anything that has intents and purposes of its own, or a sense of self, and the derivative of that is that it would suffer because of having those things, and that it would
Yeah.
be a threat to us. I think there's a very strong argument for that. I think there may be a certain inevitability to it, and we have to prepare for it, but I think we should avoid it as much as possible. And Metzinger, the German philosopher, has made that argument that we just don't understand what the conscious experience of machine minds could be well enough to do it without causing immense amounts of harm.
Yeah. My own sense is that without the Frankenstein kind of ambition that people like Elon Musk and like Sam Altman have, you don't get self-driving cars. And I think ultimately self-driving cars, you'd be surprised, I think would be a great thing. Because
You
I
do
think that,
think they'd be
yeah,
good? Yeah,
yeah, because I think they'll kill less people. So
right.
I think they'll be a great thing. But that psychological makeup of the Elon Musk or of the Sam Altman then convinces itself, and in fact, I think is pointed in the first place to this is only a stepping stone to, the next point, to the sort of artificial general intelligence, without ever thinking or pausing for a moment to think that the burden of proof on why that should be allowed to happen is on them. And we are such sort of fawning acolytes of these people that we say to ourselves, if these kind of people are making it, it must be fine. And there's a huge qualitative leap between self-driving cars and the embrace of AGI. Now, yes, you probably don't get people to invest in self-driving cars if you say this has to stop at X, Y, and Z, but we never think about that transition. Just because we can do something, just because there's probably going to be the kind of trading data explosion that will lead to the emergence of AGI, and because we're getting closer and closer to it with the development of the existing large language models, that doesn't mean that A, it's a good idea, and B, that it's inevitable.
I think the difference between AGI and the self-driving car is going to be a gradual one. It's not an A or B kind of thing. Like you already turn on your car and you say, I want to go here. And it says, there's two ways you could get there. And this way is probably faster. Is that the one you want? And that's that's an intelligent thing that it's doing with you. And if it does
Right.
it in a voice and it remembers, oh, so you're going to work today. I hope you have a good day. But if it starts pretending like it's a person, that will be towards the path of eventually you're questioning, does it have internal conscious states of its own? Now, the point that I want to avoid is where you get in the car and it says, I want to go to X, and it says, no, I want to go to Y today. I don't ever want to get in that car, right? The car that wants to take me to where it wants to go. And so that's what we have to avoid, in my opinion.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good place to pause for today and move to our lightning round, our
Sure.
news roundup.
So we already mentioned the AI bill getting killed in California by Gavin Newsom. He obviously heard the complaints, the desperate complaints of sad billionaires who were going to be inconvenienced by California's liability protections.
So you think that was what was behind it, the sort of industry lobbying?
Well, as I have said to you and our team, I do think that there's an argument, a kind of international competitiveness argument that California is the leading the place where the leading artificial intelligence stuff is happening in the world. So if we put onerous burdens on that industry and how it's going to develop, it could have a national competitiveness consequence, economic and national security. And so I do think that has to be on the table. But I think that there was a way to interpret this California law that would have been quite beneficial. And Future of Life Institute, for instance, here, Max Tegmark, his group up in Cambridge, they were lobbying for it pretty intently. And I agreed with their assessment.
Do you think Newsom's decision had to do with future presidential aspirations and not wanting to dampen his funding sources?
Well, it could be. Ro Khanna represents Silicon Valley in Congress, and I think he was against it also. That whole angle on this election, basically the tech titans who are backing Trump, like Musk, and who's the entire field operation of the Trump campaign has basically been outsourced to Elon Musk, and he's been doing it through the America PAC. So if Trump
Well,
wins, great.
if they run it like Twitter, then
Yeah,
Kamala Harris
exactly.
is
Well,
in
that's
good
my
shape.
hope is that, yeah. Apparently they had to fire their team in Arizona like 5 weeks now before the election. So hopefully they are running it like Twitter. Yeah, the way that Silicon Valley has oriented, Silicon Valley is still basically democratic, but there are these a couple billionaires like Thiel and Musk and Andreessen and Horowitz who have been tilting towards Trump. Anyway, on the Democratic side, the problem is that there's a lot of crypto money floating around as well. And apparently Kamala Harris has been sending out envoys to say, I'm not going to try to ban crypto, so you can give me your crypto money. That money just has a huge influence. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Gavin Newsom was influenced by the prospects of needing big donors.
It is one of those, I don't, it does sound like an example of one of those cases where the difference about these things between the Democrats and the Republicans is actually not as big as one would like it to be.
Well, yeah, I've never had much faith that the Trump administration had two clues about what to do about the future of technology. They did. I don't think they even staffed the Office of Technology and Science Policy in the White House during the first Trump administration. So I'm much more confident in the technocratic ambitions of the Democratic side. But yeah, we'll have to just see. There's so much that group of people and their potential impacts on the economy and national security are just so huge that neither side can really afford to screw with them too hard.
Yeah, apropos our earlier discussion, I mean, this seems like an example of the kind of classic argument that too much regulation stifles innovation. I'm sure that was the kind of point that was being made to Newsom, and
Right.
he kind of bought into it. In my book, at least, as a practical version of Luddism, there's an argument to be made to try to stifle innovation and see what survives the attempt at stifling. And if something survives the attempt at stifling, it's probably a very powerful innovation. But I think that's a kind of that's a lot of where the lines are drawn between our approach to this and the European approach to this, where they're less anxious about stifling innovation. They get some less innovation as a result. You could argue that they kind of parasitically enjoy our innovation, or you could argue that they enjoy less innovation and they're fine for it. I think that's the bigger picture of this kind of debate about a law like this.
Yeah. I mean, I've dealt with it a lot in arguments about regulating drugs and medical therapies, that
Right.
you have the hardcore libertarians who think that the FDA is evil incarnate because it's keeping people from getting the latest cool anti-cancer drug or causing it to be, cost $2 billion to develop or whatever. And then you go to the pharmaceutical companies and say, well, what do you think? Do you think we should get rid of the FDA? And they're like, please do not get rid of the FDA. We need the FDA. We cannot make drugs in a safe environment without the FDA. So, I think eventually we'll have a set of regulatory solutions, and everyone will see that that's the logical way to deal with these technologies.
Yeah, hopefully it's better than the FDA.
Yeah.
Another related news item that we thought about talking through was that apparently Google is trying to make an argument in Great Britain to allow regulators to have regulators allow it to have full access to copyrighted material. So to sort of really loosen the grip of British copyright law so that Google can use copyrighted materials to train its models. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm married to an artist, so but she's a sculptor, so she's like 2 generations away from being threatened by this, I think. Maybe. We'll see. I think I have always had the intuition that in terms of the intellectual property complaint about training these models, that if I can read your book and write something influenced by it, as long as I don't pull sections of your book out and pretend that I wrote them, that I have not violated your intellectual property. That was the reason you published the book, was for me to read it and be influenced by it.
Yeah.
And if I read a million books and do the same thing, I have not violated anyone's intellectual copyright. Now, I think we do need to make sure that it doesn't get too close to the original. I've recently seen some Chinese LLMs that do image generation. And if you ask, ChatGPT to make you a picture of Donald Duck, it'll say, I can't do that. But I think that's true. That it'll say, there's a certain restriction on my ability to violate IP. The Chinese ones don't have that. So I do think that there's that issue.
Except if you're making an image of Winnie the Pooh, right?
Well, they banned Winnie the Pooh a long time ago because of Xi Jinping. But I think the other thing is that I think also when we had search engines, back in the 90s, when the search engines started to crawl the entire internet and put all of its stuff, everything it found into a search engine, we came up with the protocol that you could put a little piece of text in your website that said, do not do that with these 5 pages or whatever. That's called the robot text. And we definitely need that. And the LLM firms have committed that they will respect such a protocol once it's developed, that you can say, I don't want my book to be included. And the firms are negotiating to compensate, big publishers or the holders of various film and image repositories for the use of their repositories. So, one of the, it would be great. It would be great if we could connect the use of these things to what's called a micropayment system, so that, every time someone used something in the LLM that was derived from a particular image, that original artist would get a micropayment. But I don't think it's like it's gone through the looking glass. It's gone through the the event horizon of a black hole. The difference between what comes out and what goes in is not, you can't trace the lines back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, you could forgive content creators for having the feeling that they're a little bit like the person who gets fired not before they train their replacement at work. Because, on the one hand, there's a real argument along the lines that you say that this could count as fair use. On the other hand, trained well enough, the motivation to read books written by humans is going to slowly decrease.
Well, this is a fourth argument for a public utilities model towards big language models or big AI, whatever, is that it's built out of us. We did the labor that they used to create this thing. I do think that that's true in the collective sense. It's not necessarily true that if someone asks it about, write something in the style of J. Hughes and it's able to mimic my style, that it's violated my copyright. I don't believe that. But we did all contribute to the creation of human culture that it then consumed and is being sold back to us. So on those grounds, I think you can make an argument that it should be public ownership.
Yeah. And I think you've also just made an argument that it's an essentially derivative technology in some basic way.
Well, that gets back to the AGI discussion in the sense that there are tests for what's called convergent creativity. There is lots of evidence that these, you ask it a novel question, and if it has 2 bodies of knowledge that are closely related to that, it can use those bodies of knowledge to answer your question. But if you say, come up with 15 wild ideas about X, it doesn't do that divergent creativity as creatively. So that may be, people think that human minds, human beings differ in their capacities for divergent, convergent creativity. But it is a feature of the human mind that we're able to think outside the box. And yeah, it's true that AGI doesn't do that incredibly well yet.
Not yet, no. All right, sir. Maybe this is a good place to pause for today.
Well, I hope you don't read any written words today or use any woven fabrics.
I'm gonna go chop wood.
Yeah, you have to add that to Leviticus. Thou shalt not read or write the written word.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, man. Talk to you soon.